The gas light had been on for 11 miles. Nora Callahan knew this because she had been watching it the same way you watch a candle burning down in a room where you have run out of matches. Not with any particular hope, just with the kind of dull, exhausted attention that fills in when panic has already spent itself and left nothing behind. She had been driving since 4 in the morning. She had left the Knoxville extended stay motel where she had been living for 3 weeks, a place that smelled of cigarettes and carpet cleaner and other people's bad decisions. And she had driven without a destination, because having a destination required believing that wherever you were going would be better than where you left. And she didn't have enough left in her to believe anything that complicated. The highway had eventually become a state road. The state road had narrowed into something with trees pressing close on both sides, and a yellow center line that had been fading for years. And then there was the gas light, and she had made herself stop calculating how much money she had left because that calculation led somewhere she wasn't ready to go. She pulled into the parking lot of a hardware store outside Maryville on a Tuesday morning in early October when the mountains had started going gold, and the air had the kind of cold in it that wasn't winter yet but was making serious preparations. The lot was mostly empty. A man in a canvas work jacket was loading cut lumber into the bed of a dark blue truck, sliding each plank in with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and didn't need to think about it. A little girl was sitting in the passenger seat with the window cracked, reading something, her dark hair in a lopsided braid. Nora sat in her car with the engine off. She had $412 in a checking account she was afraid to look at and approximately $60 in cash. She had a phone she was 2 months behind on, a suitcase with clothes she had selected at 3 in the morning while her hands were shaking, and a folder of legal documents that her attorney had faxed to the motel's front desk because Nora's laptop had been on the shared marital network and she had been afraid to use it. She had a law degree she had never practiced, a career in hospitality operations she had walked away from 11 years ago when Dorian had said it would be better if she focused on the life they were building together, and a very complete understanding of what it felt like to be 51 years old and to have misplaced, through a combination of love and inattention and a specific kind of trust that had turned out to be catastrophically misplaced, almost everything she had. The man with the lumber finished loading, pulled a thermos from the cab, poured something into the cap, then glanced over at her car. She was not crying. She had discovered sometime in the past 3 weeks that she had moved past the crying phase into something quieter and harder, like a landscape after a flood. The water gone, the damage just sitting there in plain sight, not going anywhere. He didn't say anything. He just walked over. "I've got extra," he said, holding up the thermos cap. She looked at him. He was maybe 45, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something honest. Not handsome exactly, but the kind of face you trusted without being able to say precisely why. The kind of face where the lines around the eyes suggested they had gotten there through squinting at things in direct sunlight, rather than anything worse. He had sawdust on his jacket. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at the gas gauge visible through her windshield, then back at her, without any particular judgment or urgency, just a kind of patient waiting. "There's a station across the road. It's not great, but it works." "I know," she said. "I'm just—" She stopped. She didn't finish. She didn't actually know what she was just. He went to the pump station mounted on the side of the hardware store, one of those small agricultural dispensers, the kind that serves contractors and the people who own equipment, and came back a few minutes later and knocked on her window. "Pull around," he said. "I've got an account here." "It's fine." "I can't let you do that." "You're not letting me do anything," he said. "I'm doing it. There's a difference." He walked back to the pump without waiting for her to argue. She pulled the car around. He filled her tank. He didn't make a thing of it. The little girl had gotten out of the truck by then and was standing nearby, watching with the calm, assessing eyes of a child who had learned to read situations quickly. She was maybe 9 or 10 with her father's same quality of steadiness. Present, not nervous, taking things in. "I'm June," the girl said. "Nora," she said. "Are you lost?" June asked. Not unkindly, actually with some genuine curiosity, the way children ask hard questions without meaning to be brutal about it. "Sort of," Nora said. June considered this. "Dad gets us lost sometimes," she said. "He says it's not really lost if you know how to find your way back. But I think that's just something people say." "June," the man said from the pump without looking up. "I'm just talking," June said, with the particular dignity of a child who has been told to be quiet slightly too many times and has decided to register the complaint non-verbally. The man finished. He screwed her gas cap back on, handed her the nozzle receipt, and looked at her with those steady, weathered eyes. "There's a diner about a mile down," he said. "They make decent eggs, in case you haven't eaten." "Thank you," she said. "Seriously, can I—" She looked in her purse, calculating. "No," he said. She didn't argue. He had said it the same way he had said everything else. Not unkindly, just finely. Like a door that had been closed not to keep her out, but simply because that was where the door was. His name, she found out later, was Eli Sutton. She went to the diner. She sat in a window booth and ordered coffee because it was the cheapest thing on the menu and because she was cold in a way that had gotten into her bones somewhere around Chattanooga the week before and hadn't fully left. She was looking at the legal folder, not reading it, just looking at it the way you look at something you already know everything about and are just not ready to stop being shocked by, when she heard the bell over the door and looked up, and there was the girl, June, walking directly toward her table with a piece of paper in her hand. Her father was at the counter, ordering, pretending he didn't know what his daughter was doing or doing a very good impression of someone who didn't. June put the piece of paper on the table and walked back without saying anything. It was a hand-drawn map, roads indicated by wavy lines, trees represented by small triangles, a building labeled The Barn, and another labeled Main House. At the bottom, in careful, slightly oversized printing, "We have a guest room. Dad says it's okay. June." Nora looked over at the counter. Eli was looking at his menu. His ears, she noticed, were slightly red. She thought about saying no. She had spent a significant portion of the last 3 weeks saying no to things, to the settlement her attorney had urged her to accept, to the suggestion that she move in with her sister in Asheville, to the well-meaning but faintly devastating suggestion from her college roommate that perhaps this was actually an opportunity if you looked at it a certain way. She had said no to all of it, and she wasn't entirely sure the no had been the right call, but she had made it each time from the same stubborn, bruised, still-standing place inside herself that was also the thing she was most grateful for at the moment. The thing she was most certain was still really hers. But she was sitting in a diner with $400 and a gas tank that was now full because a stranger had filled it without being asked, and his daughter had drawn her a map. She folded the map and put it in her pocket. The cabin on Eli Sutton's property in Townsend was small and clean and smelled of pine and dried herbs that someone had hung in the kitchen window. It had 1 bedroom, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that had been repaired at some point with something that was probably not the manufacturer's recommended solution, but worked, and a porch that faced east so that it caught the morning light over the ridge. Nora stood on that porch on her first morning there and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that wasn't exactly okay, but was at least quiet. Like the inside of a library. Like a place where you were not required to be anything in particular. She had told Eli that first evening over a dinner of soup that June had made with the serious, methodical confidence of a child who had been cooking since she was small, that she would pay him back as soon as she was back on her feet. He had said there was no need. She had said there was, for her. He had looked at her for a moment and then nodded, as if this made sense to him, as if he understood the specific kind of pride she was talking about and respected it without needing to argue it down. In the meantime, she asked if there was anything she could do. Eli ran a custom furniture workshop out of a converted barn 50 yards from the main house. Chairs and tables and built-in shelving, mostly commissioned pieces, some wholesale to a couple of small boutique hotels in the region. The work was good. His hands, she had noticed, were not just the hands of someone who built things for a living. They were the hands of someone who thought about what he was building. Precise, unhurried, attentive in a way that showed in everything he made. The business was a different matter. The invoices were organized in 3 different systems that did not communicate with each other. There were 2 checking accounts and a PayPal account and a handwritten ledger that recorded approximately 60% of his transactions and had the remaining 40% on receipts stuffed into a coffee can on the workshop shelf. His taxes had been filed late for 2 of the past 3 years by a cousin who had since moved to Colorado. There was an outstanding invoice to a hotel in Gatlinburg for $4,000 that was 8 months old and had apparently been forgotten by everyone involved. "I can do this," Nora said, standing in the workshop with the coffee can in one hand and a 2-year-old tax return in the other. Eli looked at her from his workbench, where he was planing the edge of a walnut tabletop. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I can. Those aren't the same thing." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that might have been amusement, or recognition, or some combination of the two. "All right," he said. She started that afternoon. It took her 4 days to reconstruct the full financial picture for the past 2 years, and another 3 to set up a system that would keep it coherent going forward. In the evenings, she sat with June at the kitchen table while June did homework and Nora worked through the invoices. And sometimes June would look up and ask questions, not about the finances, but about other things, with the casual sideways curiosity of children who have decided you're worth talking to. "What was your job before? Did you like it? Do you miss it? Have you ever been to Europe? Do you think it's weird that some people name their cars?" Nora answered honestly. It had been so long since anyone had asked her questions that required honest answers, that the novelty of it was almost startling. A good kind of startling, like cold water when you're not expecting it. On the 8th day, Nora was cross-referencing payment records against a folder of old certified mail that had been stacked behind the coffee can. Most of it was junk. Some of it was correspondence from suppliers. At the bottom of the stack, still sealed in its original envelope, was a letter from a law firm in Charlotte dated 14 months earlier. Under it was another from the same firm, 6 months before that. Under that a third, from 18 months ago. She shouldn't have opened them. They weren't addressed to her. But the first one was sitting at an angle, and the return address was clearly a legal firm and something in her. The part of her that had spent the past 8 days reconstructing a financial story from scattered evidence, made her pick it up. She went and knocked on the workshop door. Eli looked up from a mortise he was cutting. "Have you ever opened these?" she asked, holding up the envelopes. He looked at them. "I figured it was nothing," he said. "Probably related to the estate." "Whose estate?" A pause. "My father's," he said. "He died 4 years ago. I had the main stuff handled through a probate attorney in Nashville. The rest," he gestured at the envelopes, "I just didn't get around to it." She put the envelopes on his workbench. "I think you need to get around to it," she said. He read them that evening, alone, while June was asleep. Nora was in the cabin when she saw the light in the workshop go on and then stay on for 2 hours. She thought about going over. She made tea instead and waited. He came to the cabin door at almost 11. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. He sat down across from her at the small kitchen table and put the letters down between them. "How much do you know about trust law?" he asked. As it turned out, she knew enough. The Sutton Family Capital Trust had been established by Eli's father, a civil and structural engineer named Raymond Sutton, who had, over the course of a 40-year career, accumulated a portfolio of real estate holdings, infrastructure contracts, and private equity positions that were significantly larger than Eli had understood. Raymond Sutton had been a quiet, private man who had not believed in discussing money with his children until the time was right, and had apparently died before concluding that the time was right. The trust was valued, per the most recent trustee assessment letter, at somewhere in the neighborhood of $230 million. Eli had known there was money. He had not known there was that much money. More specifically, he had not known, because the letter explaining this had arrived after his father's death and been filed away unopened, that the trust included a 14% equity stake in Voss Aviation and Hospitality Group, a position Raymond Sutton had taken in a secondary offering 8 years earlier through a private placement that had never made headlines and had never been on any public record Eli would have had reason to look at. Nora went very still when she read that name. "You know this company?" Eli asked, watching her face. "Yes," she said. "I was married to the man who owns it." The silence that followed had a particular texture to it, the texture of two people recalibrating simultaneously, each from a very different angle, toward a shared point neither of them had anticipated. Nora's attorney, a methodical woman named Patricia Oakes, who had been practicing matrimonial and financial law in Knoxville for 30 years, had told her 3 weeks ago that the case for contesting the divorce settlement on grounds of financial fraud was theoretically strong and practically very difficult. Theoretically strong because there was clear evidence, or at least the shape of clear evidence, that Dorian Voss had structured the settlement to exclude assets he had been moving quietly for years, assets that should have been marital property and had been reclassified, rerouted, or simply made to disappear through a network of subsidiary companies Nora had not known existed and had not been told about. Practically very difficult because the documentation trail was complex enough that Dorian's legal team could spend years disputing each piece of it, and Nora's resources for a prolonged legal fight were approximately zero. What Patricia Oakes had not known, because no one had known, was that somewhere in a certified mail folder behind a coffee can in a furniture workshop in Townsend, Tennessee, there was a document that changed the equation considerably. Because Eli Sutton's trust held a 14% equity stake in Dorian Voss's company, and because Eli Sutton had never activated his status as a co-trustee, the trust had been in a kind of administrative suspension, present, enrolled, but silent. The moment Eli activated his co-trustee status, he was entitled by the trust's own bylaws to request a full compliance audit of all entities in which the trust held a significant position, including Voss Aviation and Hospitality Group, including a compliance audit that the company's board of directors would be legally obligated to facilitate, including an examination of financial records that Dorian Voss's legal team had been very carefully ensuring would never be subject to outside review. Nora called Patricia Oakes from the cabin porch the next morning at 7:30. Then she called the number on the card that had been sitting at the bottom of her handbag for 2 years. The card of a woman she had met once at a charity dinner and had held on to without knowing why. The card of a forensic financial consultant named Simone Archer, who answered on the second ring and said, before Nora had finished explaining, "I've been waiting for someone to call me about Dorian Voss for 3 years. Tell me what you have." Simone Archer had made her reputation on exactly this kind of case. Not the ones that were simple, not the ones where the fraud was obvious and the paper trail was clean, but the ones that were designed to look clean from every angle while hiding something enormous in the negative space. She was 62, had previously worked for the SEC's Enforcement Division, had left under circumstances she described only as a disagreement about pace, and had since operated as an independent forensic consultant with a client list she never discussed and a success rate her opponents found, uniformly, infuriating. She drove up to Townsend 2 days after Nora's call, in a 10-year-old Volvo with 2 banker's boxes in the back seat and a laptop that was covered in stickers that appeared to be satirical takes on financial regulation. She spent 45 minutes reviewing what Nora had assembled, another hour on the phone with Patricia Oakes, and then sat at Eli's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked at Nora with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "He made a mistake," Simone said. "Which one?" Nora asked. "He underestimated how much you would eventually have to lose," Simone said. "People like Dorian always do. They look at someone and they see what that person has access to right now, and they discount everything else. He saw a woman with no independent income, no current professional standing, no obvious allies. He thought you'd take the settlement and go be quiet somewhere." She looked at the documents spread across the table. "He didn't account for the possibility that you'd end up in a furniture workshop in the middle of Tennessee with a man whose father quietly bought 14% of his company 8 years ago." "Nobody could have accounted for that," Nora said. "That's exactly the problem with underestimating people," Simone said. "You can't predict what they'll find when they start looking." What Simone found over the following 6 weeks was this. Dorian Voss had, over the course of their 11-year marriage, used a network of 9 limited liability companies, incorporated in Delaware, Wyoming, and twice in the Cayman Islands, to root assets that should have been classified as marital property. The total moved somewhere between $40 and $60 million, the range dependent on how you accounted for appreciation and on which forensic accounting methodology you applied to the intercompany transfers. The money had not disappeared. It had been reclassified, turned from joint assets into corporate assets held by entities that Dorian controlled individually, with documentation that had been carefully backdated and carefully, meticulously forged, including a property transfer agreement that bore Nora's signature, dated to a week she had spent in Savannah at her mother's emergency surgery, a week during which she had not been in Knoxville, had not had access to any of the relevant documents, and had not signed anything more legally significant than a hospital visitor form. The signature on the property transfer agreement was not hers. It was close. It was close enough that Dorian's team had clearly banked on no one examining it too carefully, on no one having a reason to examine it at all. They had been right about that, until they weren't. Patricia Oakes filed a motion to reopen the divorce proceeding on grounds of fraud. Simone submitted a formal compliance audit request through Eli's co-trustee activation, which was, once the paperwork was processed, legally impossible for Voss Aviation and Hospitality Group's board to deny it. The board, several of whom, it emerged, had their own concerns about the direction of the company's finances and had been waiting for a mechanism to surface them, did not try very hard to deny it. The SEC inquiry opened on a Thursday. The federal investigation was announced the following Monday. Dorian Voss's attorneys filed 3 separate motions to delay or block the audit in the first week. All 3 were denied. On a Wednesday morning in early December, Nora was sitting at Eli's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a folder of documents she no longer felt sick looking at when her phone buzzed with a news alert. She read it once, then again. Then she set the phone face down on the table and looked at the grain of the wood for a moment. June was sitting across from her, working on a history paper, her pen scratching steadily in the particular rhythm of a child who has found her groove and intends to stay in it. "Is that the bad one?" June asked without looking up. Nora looked at her. "What do you mean?" June shrugged, still writing. "The one who made things hard," she said. "Dad said something happened and things were going to be okay. I figured it was that." "Yes," Nora said. "That's the bad one." "Good," June said, and turned a page. Nora sat with that for a moment. The table was solid under her hands. Outside the window, the Smokies were doing what they did in December, holding their weather close, dark green and patient, indifferent to the small dramas of the people at their feet in the entirely reassuring way of things that have been there longer than everything and will be there after. Dorian Voss was taken into federal custody on charges of wire fraud, securities manipulation, and document forgery. His attorneys entered a not guilty plea. The civil case was proceeding separately, and Patricia Oakes had, in her measured way, described Nora's eventual recovery as substantial. Nora had asked her to be more specific. Patricia had said something like, "Enough that you won't need to worry about gas money for the foreseeable future," and Nora had laughed, which had surprised both of them. 3 separate parties contacted Nora in the weeks that followed. 2 were board members from Dorian's company, the hospitality division now in the hands of an interim management team, quietly suggesting that Nora's operational background made her a natural candidate to lead the restructuring. 1 was a private equity group that had been circling Voss Aviation for years and now saw an opening. They all made the same implicit argument. "You built your expertise on this. You know this world. Here is the door back into it." She stood in front of each door for a moment and felt absolutely nothing pulling her through it. No ambition, no appetite, no flicker of the satisfaction she remembered from the years before she had handed her career to someone else's vision of what her life should look like. She had run hotels. She had been good at it. And somewhere in the process of being good at it for Dorian's benefit, she had hollowed out whatever had made her want to do it in the first place. And filling that hollow back up with the same thing that had emptied it seemed, when she stood in front of those doors and thought about it honestly, like a very poor use of whatever time she had left. She said no to all of them. She didn't agonize over it. She said it the same way you set down something heavy that you've been carrying for longer than you should have. Not with triumph, just with the simple, clean relief of an unclenched hand. It was in that same week that she found the drafting table. She had gone into the barn to look for a file box Eli had mentioned, and she found it in the corner, covered with a canvas tarp that had been there long enough to gather a fine patina of sawdust. It was a proper architect's drafting table, the tilting kind with a parallel rule still attached, a lamp clamped to the side, the surface worn smooth and marked with the ghost traces of old drawings. On the shelf below it rolled tubes, pencils in a ceramic jar, a set of drafting instruments in a leather case. She stood there looking at it for a moment. That evening, after dinner, she asked him. He was washing dishes. June had gone to read. The kitchen had that particular quality of a room after a meal, warm and slightly close, smelling of whatever they had cooked. "There's a drafting table in the corner of the barn," she said. He kept washing. "I know. It's not a hobbyist's table," she said. A pause. "No," he said. "You studied architecture," she said. It wasn't a question. She had found the framed degree, face to the wall, in the small study off the main hall, weeks ago, and had said nothing, and had kept saying nothing until now. "I did," he said. "When did you stop?" The dishwater ran. He turned the tap off, dried his hands, and leaned against the counter. He looked at the window, which was dark now and giving back the kitchen in reflection. The 2 of them, the table between them, the light overhead. "When Lily died," he said, "June's mother. She died when June was not quite 2. And I had a practice in Nashville, a small one. We were doing interesting work, and He stopped. Reorganized. "I couldn't do it and do June," he said. "Not the way she needed. So I stopped doing it." "That was 7 years ago," Nora said. 8, he said. "And the woodworking?" "The woodworking is honest," he said. "It's immediate. You start something and you finish it, and the thing you made is right there. It doesn't ask anything of you except your attention. At the time, that was what I could offer." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. In the window's reflection, she could see both their faces. His careful, hers waiting. "I don't know," he said. "I've been thinking about it." She didn't push. She had learned in the weeks she had been here that pushing was not a language Eli responded to. What he responded to was presence. Just being in the room, just being there, and waiting to see what he decided to do with that. The next morning, she came to the workshop to drop off a payment confirmation she had processed for him, and found him at the drafting table with a pencil in his hand and a piece of trace paper taped over a blank sheet, and something on it that was clearly, unmistakably, the beginning of a building. She put the payment confirmation on the workbench and left without saying anything. He didn't say anything about it either. But the table was no longer covered with the tarp, and the pencils were no longer in the jar. The idea for the lodges had started, as most real things do, as something too small to be called an idea. It had been an evening in November, Eli's kitchen, a dinner that had run long because no one had particularly wanted to end it, and Nora had said something about the hospitality business. Not from nostalgia, just observationally. Something she had noticed about the gaps in what was available to people who wanted to come to the Smokies and be in the mountains without paying resort prices or staying in places where the design philosophy seemed to be rustic, deployed in a way that cost $500 a night and felt like no one had ever actually gone outside. There's nothing between the tourist traps and the Airbnbs that feel like a closet, she had said. Nothing that's actually designed to be in the place it's in. Nothing that makes the location feel like the point. Eli had been quiet for a moment. Then he had gotten up, found a pencil, and started drawing on the back of an invoice. Not a plan, just the shape of a thought. The way a building might sit in a hillside. The way you might orient a window to catch specific light at a specific hour. The way a porch might frame a particular view. June had looked over his shoulder and said, "That looks like somewhere I'd want to stay." They had built the idea slowly, the way good things get built, not with urgency, not with the kind of aggressive momentum that usually meant someone was overcompensating for something, but steadily, a piece at a time, over dinners and early mornings and evenings on the east-facing porch of the guest cabin. Nora brought the operational knowledge, the practical architecture of what it meant to run a hospitality property, the supply chains and staffing models, and the particular alchemy of making a guest feel that the place had been waiting specifically for them. Eli brought the actual architecture, and the woodworking, and the quality of attention he brought to everything. The way he would sit with a problem and not force it, just live near it until it told him what it wanted to be. The financing came from several directions. The civil settlement with Dorian's estate, still in process but with terms that Patricia Oakes described as favorable in a way that should make his attorneys consider other careers, provided a substantial portion. Eli's decision to activate his trust and accept the role in the family estate his father had intended for him provided another. The third source was Simone Archer, who appeared at Eli's kitchen table one morning with a folder of documents and said, "I want to invest. I've spent 30 years watching money do bad things. I would like to watch it do something decent for once." They found 4 properties, all within an hour of Townsend, all with the specific quality of land they were looking for. Land that had been left alone long enough to develop a character, land that didn't need to be dressed up, land that sat against the mountain the way something settled sits, without effort. Eli designed each building from scratch, not themed, not marketed, not positioned. Designed, the way you design something when you care where the light falls, and what the guest will see when they open their eyes in the morning. Nora ran the operations. She wrote the descriptions herself, the ones that would eventually go on the website, and they were the best thing she had written since her graduate thesis on vernacular architecture in the American South, which she had written at 28 before she had met Dorian and before she had begun the long, slow process of editing herself down to what someone else needed her to be. In the middle of all of this, in the way that things happen when 2 people are doing real work together in a confined space over a significant stretch of time, something else was also happening. It wasn't dramatic. There was no particular evening that she could have pointed to afterward and said, "There, that was when." It was more cumulative than that, accumulated in the small, specific weight of 10,000 ordinary moments, the kind of moments that don't announce themselves and don't need to. It was the way he had started leaving a second cup out in the morning before she came in from the cabin. It was the way June had, at some point without discussion, begun setting 3 places at the table by default. It was the conversation they had had one night about his wife. Lily. Her name had been Lily. She had been a landscape designer. She had died of an aneurysm on a Thursday afternoon in March, when June was 20 months old, and Eli had been 37, and had had, as he put it, no preparation whatsoever for what came after. He had told her this without self-pity, which was not the same as without pain. The pain was still there, was clearly still very much there, but it had been lived with long enough that he could hold it and talk at the same time. And there was something in that, in the witnessing of it, that felt like a kind of trust she had not been offered in a very long time. She had told him in exchange about the specific shape of what her marriage had actually been, not the fraud, not the legal story, but the quieter damage, the way you can let yourself be loved in a way that is also a kind of erasing, the way you can confuse being chosen with being seen, the way she had spent 11 years making herself smaller in increments so gradual she hadn't noticed until she went to do something that required her actual size and found she had forgotten what that was. He had listened. He had not tried to fix it or reframe it, or tell her that she was being too hard on herself, or that it would get better, or any of the things people said that were well-meant and also, somehow, beside the point. He had just listened, and then he had said, "You seem like your actual size to me." She had looked at him for a long moment. The porch. October cold. The ridge going dark. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me in years," she said. "I mean it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it nice." Neither of them had said anything else about it for a while. But something had settled, like an account that had been in dispute for a long time and had finally, quietly, been resolved. The first lodge, the one they were calling Sutton Callahan Ridge House because June had suggested they use both names and had been so matter-of-fact about it that neither of them had thought to argue, was finished on a Friday in early November, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, which Eli attributed to good planning and Nora attributed to the fact that he had been building things with his hands for 8 years and knew how to look at a deadline the way you look at a horizon. Something real, something you're actually moving toward, not something theoretical. The opening weekend was not a press event. It was not an industry preview. Nora had been clear about this from the beginning, with a clarity that surprised her at first and then didn't. The first people to stay here would be the staff of the Family Services Center in Chattanooga, where Eli had been brought on a February night 11 years ago, when his credit card had been declined, and his daughter was 2, and his wife was 4 days dead. And he had driven from Nashville with no plan and no money, and a child wrapped in a blanket, and nowhere to go. She had called them. The director had cried a little, which she had apologized for. And Nora had said there was absolutely no need to apologize. And then Nora had also cried a little, which she also apologized for. And the director had said the same thing back to her. The staff arrived on a Saturday morning, 9 of them plus 2 spouses and 1 child, a 5-year-old boy named Marcus, who had been told they were going to a cabin in the mountains, and who treated this information with the kind of focused, comprehensive delight that only 5-year-olds can bring to a piece of news. June had made the welcome signs. She had made them out of watercolor paper with the good paints, and they were specific. Each one had the guest's name on it and a drawing of something she had decided they would like, which she had determined through a series of questions she had asked Nora over the previous week with great seriousness. The director's sign had a dog on it, because June had ascertained that the director had a dog named Harold. Marcus's sign had a mountain on it, with a very small person at the top with their arms raised, which Marcus looked at for a long time before declaring it the best thing. Nora stood on the porch of the main lodge in the cold, watching cars come up the gravel drive, and felt something that she had spent some time since trying to name correctly, because it seemed important to be accurate about it. It was not triumph. It was not relief, though there was some relief in it. It was not happiness exactly, or not only happiness. It was something more like recognition. The feeling of arriving at a place you didn't know you were trying to reach and finding that it is, actually, home. Not in the sense of familiar, in the sense of fitting, in the sense of, this is the shape I was trying to get to. This is what I was working toward even when I didn't know it. She thought about the night in Chattanooga. She had been working the late desk, covering for a colleague who had called in sick, and a man had come in with a child, and a credit card that didn't work, and a face that had the particular emptiness of someone running on fumes, past the point where fumes usually run out. She had covered the room. She had called a cab in the morning. She had used the discretionary fund, which she was technically supposed to have manager approval to access, and her manager had given her a mild talking to about it the following week, and she had said, "Yes, I understand. I'll make sure to ask next time," and had not, in any honest sense, regretted it even for a moment. She had not thought about it again after that, not because it hadn't mattered, but because it was simply a thing she had done that seemed necessary in the moment and then was over. And the idea that it might become a story, that it might become this story, was not something her 28-year-old self would have had the architecture to imagine. Eli came to stand beside her. He had a thermos, the same kind she had noticed as the one he'd had in the truck on the day they met. He poured 2 caps and handed her one. "She's directing the room assignments," he said, toward June, who was inside apparently explaining to Marcus that the cabin with the green door was the best one, and that she had specifically requested it for him. "She has opinions," Nora said. "She's had opinions since she was 3, he said. "I've mostly learned to work with them." They stood on the porch in the November cold, watching the mountain hold its position against the sky in the way mountains do, as though time itself were simply another kind of weather, interesting enough, not particularly urgent. "I keep thinking about something," Nora said. "What?" "That night in Chattanooga. I've been trying to remember what I was thinking when I did it, when I covered the room and called the cab." She paused. "I don't think I was thinking anything particularly profound. I think I just looked at you, at the two of you, and thought, this is the thing that makes sense to do right now." Eli held his cup in both hands, the way he held things, entirely, without distraction. "That's usually enough," he said. "It was $200, she said. "It was $200 and a phone call and getting someone in trouble with her manager. It was one night," he said. "One night that went differently than it would have gone." He looked at the mountain. "I don't think you need to make it bigger than that to justify where we are." "I know," she said. "That's actually what I've been thinking about. The fact that it doesn't need to be big. The fact that it was just a thing you do. Because you're in a position to do it and it's the obvious thing and someone needs it. And then you go home and you don't think about it anymore." She looked at the lodge, at the warm light in the windows, at June, now visible through the glass, apparently engaged in a very serious conversation with Marcus about something involving the welcome signs. And then somehow, at a remove of 11 years, it comes back as this. "Not because of what you did," Eli said. "Not just because of that. You did something and then you spent the rest of the time, all of it, being the person who would do that. That's what came back." She thought about that. The thermos cap was warm between her hands. Above the ridge, the first stars were coming out in the specific, unhurried way of stars that have been doing this for longer than anything on Earth and have no performance anxiety about it whatsoever. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay," he said. She took a breath. "The other night, you showed me the plans for the second site. You'd drawn the guest cabins oriented differently from the first iteration, and you said it was about catching the afternoon light. But then this morning I saw the revision, and you'd changed it back. A pause. You noticed that? I noticed things, she said. What changed? He was quiet for a moment in the particular way he was quiet when he was deciding how much to say, which was different from the way he was quiet when there was nothing to say. I changed it because the first orientation was the one I wanted, he said. And I changed it back because for a long time I've been making decisions based on what's easiest to maintain, what takes the least out of you, what doesn't risk anything. He looked at the mountain. I'm trying to stop doing that. Nora looked at him. He was looking at the ridge, and in the last light, he had the quality of something that has been shaped by weather into its final form. Not worn down, not diminished, but arrived at, specific, its own thing entirely. Good, she said. They stayed on the porch a while longer after that, in the good, easy silence of two people who no longer feel the need to fill the space between them. The kind of silence that takes time to earn. Inside, June had apparently finished settling the guests and had come to find them through the window, and was now tapping on the glass with the expression of a child who has managed logistics and would like some acknowledgement of this. Eli raised his thermos in her direction. She rolled her eyes and disappeared back toward the sound of voices and warmth. From the driveway below, the sound of a car door, a last arriving guest, gravel under feet. From the ridge, the cold, clean smell of pine and November and altitude. From somewhere inside, the sound of Marcus, 5 years old, telling someone very emphatically about a mountain with a person at the top. Nora thought, for the last time that evening, about Chattanooga. About a February night 11 years ago. About $200 that had not been hers to spend. A cab she had ordered without asking. A credit card declined. A child in a blanket. A man with an empty face. She had made one night slightly less hard. They had both done the rest themselves, separately, and then somehow, together. She went inside.